The morning sun stretched across the small town, touching the police station's gray walls with a dull shine. Inside, the sound of boots, phones, and chatter filled the air. Among all the noise, one man stood out, Officer Daniel. People in the department said his presence could fill a room before he even spoke. Tall, clean-cut, and always in control, Daniel carried his badge like a symbol of power. To most people, that badge meant protection. To him, it meant something more, authority that couldn't be questioned. Daniel had been with the department for over 15 years. He knew every shortcut, every hidden rule, every judge who owed him a favor. The town had grown used to seeing him on the streets, his patrol car parked outside cafes or by the courthouse steps. He was the kind of man people respected, or at least pretended to. Some admired his confidence. Others feared it. Either way, Daniel liked the feeling. Over time, he started to believe that no one could touch him. He had earned his reputation early on. In his first few years, he was known for solving cases quickly and getting results even when others couldn't. It didn't take long before he was promoted. But with each new stripe came a little more arrogance. He started cutting corners, telling himself it was for the greater good. A skipped report here, a little pressure there. Nothing serious, he thought. But those small steps turned into habits, and those habits turned into power plays. People inside the department noticed, but no one said much. It was easier to stay quiet. Daniel was the kind of officer who could make or break careers. He had friends in high places, judges, prosecutors, even a few city council members. If someone crossed him, they'd soon find themselves reassigned or ignored. He didn't shout or threaten. He didn't have to. His silence carried weight. On the surface, Daniel's life looked picture perfect. A neat home, a new truck, and a family that smiled in public. But behind closed doors, things were different. His marriage was falling apart. His teenage son barely spoke to him. The man who enforced law and order at work couldn't control the chaos at home. Yet even then, he refused to admit he was wrong. He believed his badge could fix anything, that as long as he wore it, he could bend life to his will. Daniel often said the same thing to new officers. Respect doesn't come from kindness. It comes from strength. He meant it. When someone questioned him, he'd lean back in his chair, smirk, and say, "You think you know better than me?" It wasn't a question. It was a warning. The town itself wasn't large. Just a few neighborhoods, a single main street, and a courthouse that looked older than most of the people working in it. Everyone knew everyone, and gossip moved faster than patrol cars. So when Daniel's name came up, people lowered their voices. They didn't want trouble. There were stories about tickets that disappeared, about witnesses who suddenly changed their statements, about people who backed off after a friendly talk with the officer. But without proof, no one dared to challenge him. One of Daniel's colleagues, Officer Lewis, had once tried. Lewis was young, idealistic, still full of belief that the badge stood for fairness. He confronted Daniel about a report that didn't match what actually happened. Daniel listened quietly, his face calm. Then he smiled, patted Lewis on the shoulder, and said, "Son, if you want to last in this job, you learn when to keep things simple." The next week, Lewis was transferred to night shifts in the farthest district. He didn't question things again. Daniel's power grew not because of the system, but because he understood it too well. He knew exactly how far he could go without crossing a legal line. He played by the rules, just enough to make himself look clean. When someone filed a complaint, it was dismissed for lack of evidence. When someone tried to speak up, they were labeled disgruntled. The truth was, Daniel had built a shield around himself made of fear and favors. Still, there were moments, small, quiet moments, when even he felt a twinge of doubt. Sometimes late at night he'd look at himself in the mirror and see the lines around his eyes, the fatigue in his face. He'd remember why he became a police officer in the first place, to make a difference, to protect people. But those thoughts never stayed long. Pride always came back stronger. "I earned this," he'd whisper to himself. "I deserve this." And the next morning, the confident officer was back. There was one particular day that marked the beginning of the end, though no one knew it then. Daniel was standing outside the courthouse, adjusting his sunglasses, when a man he had once arrested walked by and muttered under his breath. Daniel heard it but didn't react. He didn't have to. The man's eyes dropped immediately. That small exchange reminded Daniel of how much control he had, and how much he enjoyed it. Control was addictive. He wanted more. Inside the courthouse, Daniel often acted like he owned the place. Judges greeted him by name. Prosecutors trusted his reports without question. When he took the witness stand, his word carried more weight than most lawyers' arguments. He wore his uniform like armor and spoke with the confidence of someone who knew no one would dare to call him a liar. The courtroom was his stage, and every case was a performance he rarely lost. But over time, that confidence turned into carelessness. Daniel started treating cases like personal games. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to prove something. If someone challenged his authority, he made sure they regretted it. He once told a colleague, "Nobody beats me in court. Not because I'm lucky, because I don't let them." That mindset worked for years, until it didn't. Outside of work, Daniel's circle grew smaller. Friends stopped inviting him out. His wife started spending more time at her sister's house. Even his son avoided dinner conversations. He could sense their distance, but he blamed them for it. "People just don't understand the pressure I'm under," he'd say, pouring himself another drink. "They'd crumble if they lived my life." He couldn't see that he was already crumbling, just in slow motion. At work, he was still the star. When younger officers struggled, they went to him for advice. When someone made a mistake, Daniel fixed it, but not without reminding them who saved their career. "You owe me one," he'd say half-jokingly, though everyone knew he meant it. Those favors added up, forming a quiet web of loyalty that made him untouchable. Yet beneath that surface, resentment simmered. Some officers wanted to see him fail. They whispered in the locker rooms, shared rumors, and waited for the day he'd go too far. But Daniel was careful, always one step ahead. Or so he thought. One cloudy afternoon, as rain tapped softly against his office window, Daniel looked over a new case file. It seemed simple, a minor obstruction charge against a local business owner. Nothing unusual. But the woman's name caught his eye. He didn't know her personally, but something about her file made him pause. A quiet smile spread across his face as he thought about calling her into court. Another easy win, he figured. Just one more small show of power in a long list of victories. He didn't know it yet, but that simple decision, that single act of arrogance, would be the one that changed everything. The woman he was about to summon wasn't like the others. She wouldn't bow, she wouldn't flinch, and she wouldn't forget. That night, as Daniel locked his office and walked out into the cool evening air, he felt the familiar weight of the badge against his chest. He touched it lightly, almost as if it were a medal of honor. To him, it was proof of his control, his authority, his worth. What he didn't realize was that soon, that same badge would become the very thing that exposed him. For now, though he was still on top, confident, respected, and blind to the storm quietly gathering on the horizon, the streets were calm, the town asleep, and Officer Daniel, the man who thought his badge made him untouchable, had no idea that his life was about to unravel, one truth at a time. The morning started like any other. The courthouse buzzed with voices, papers shuffled, and the smell of coffee drifted through the hallways. Officer Daniel walked in with his usual confident stride, greeting people with a nod. He had a new case in hand, one that he barely paid attention to. It was just another summons, another person to stand before the judge. To him, it was routine. He didn't know then that this file would become the beginning of his downfall. The case was against a woman named Clara. She owned a small flower shop near the edge of town, a quiet place most people passed by without noticing. According to the paperwork, she was being summoned for obstruction of justice. Daniel didn't remember her name from any real investigation. He looked through the file again and frowned slightly. Something felt off, but he shrugged it away. Mistakes in paperwork weren't new, and besides, he could handle anything that came up in court. He told himself it was probably nothing. That afternoon, a deputy delivered the summons to Clara's shop. She was busy arranging bouquets for a local wedding when the paper landed on her counter. She looked at it, confused. "There must be some mistake," she said softly, glancing at the officer. He didn't have answers, only instructions to appear in court the following week. As the deputy left, Clara stood frozen, the flowers in her hands trembling. She had never been in trouble before. She didn't even have a parking ticket. Clara closed her shop early that day. She sat at her kitchen table, reading the summons over and over, her hands shaking. She couldn't understand how her name ended up on a legal document. The charge didn't make sense. She had never met Officer Daniel, never been involved in any police matter. Fear slowly turned into frustration. She picked up her phone, dialed the number listed on the paper, and asked to speak to the officer in charge of the case. The woman on the line told her to wait. A few moments later, Daniel's voice came through. "This is Officer Daniel," he said, his tone calm but distant. Clara took a deep breath. "Officer, there must be some mistake. I received a summons for something I didn't do." Daniel leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his desk. "If your name is on it, there's a reason. You can explain yourself in court." "I shouldn't have to explain something that never happened," Clara replied, trying to stay composed. "I think someone mixed up the names." Daniel chuckled under his breath. "Ma'am, the system doesn't make mistakes like that. If you've been summoned, there's evidence." His words hit her like a slap. "Evidence of what?" she asked. He didn't answer directly. "You'll see in court," he said, and the line went silent. Clara sat there for a long time after the call ended, staring at the paper again. Something in his tone unsettled her. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, like he enjoyed her confusion. That night she told her brother about it. He advised her to get legal help. "Don't go in there alone," he said. "If this man's as sure of himself as he sounds, you'll need someone who can stand up to him." The next morning, Clara visited a small law office downtown. Her lawyer, Mr. Hayes, listened carefully as she explained everything. He read through the summons, flipping through the attached documents. His brow furrowed. "This doesn't look right," he murmured. "It says you interfered with an ongoing investigation 2 weeks ago. Were you anywhere near that?" "I was at work," Clara said. "You can check my store cameras." "I didn't even leave town," Hayes nodded. "Then we'll get to the bottom of it. Don't worry." Meanwhile, Daniel went about his week like nothing had happened. To him, Clara's case was small, a minor issue that would be resolved quickly. He had dozens like it every month. But word of Clara's confusion reached one of his colleagues, Officer Lewis, the same young man Daniel had once silenced years before. Something about it didn't sit right with him. He quietly checked the case file and noticed the same thing Clara's lawyer had. Her name was added to the affidavit after it had already been signed. That wasn't standard procedure. Lewis hesitated. He thought about bringing it up, but remembered what had happened the last time he questioned Daniel. Still, the doubt stayed with him. A few days later, Clara's court date arrived. She walked into the courthouse in a simple gray dress, clutching her folder of documents. She was nervous but determined. Daniel was already there, standing near the front, talking to the prosecutor. He didn't even glance her way at first. When he finally noticed her, he gave a small, dismissive smile as if she were already guilty. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The proceedings began, and Daniel presented his report with his usual confidence. He spoke clearly, using all the right legal terms. To anyone else, it would have sounded convincing. But when Clara's lawyer began asking questions, cracks started to appear. "Officer," Hayes said, "can you confirm when this statement was filed?" Daniel flipped through his folder, his calmness slipping for the first time. The dates didn't match. The affidavit had been amended 2 days later, something the law didn't allow without approval. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Officer, do you have documentation for that amendment?" Daniel hesitated, then said, "It must be in the system." "It isn't," Hayes replied, holding up a printed copy from the court's database. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt cornered. He tried to steer the conversation back to procedure, but the damage was done. The judge didn't make any final decision that day, but she ordered further review. Clara walked out of the courtroom relieved, but she knew it wasn't over. She could see the frustration in Daniel's eyes as she left, a silent promise that he wasn't done with her yet. Outside, Clara's lawyer turned to her. "We're going to need everything you have. Receipts, camera footage, witness statements. If what I suspect is true, he added your name to make the case stronger." "Why would he do that?" Clara asked. "Because some people don't like losing," Hayes said quietly. Over the next few days, Clara gathered every piece of evidence she could. Her shop's security footage showed she was working during the supposed incident. Customers confirmed her presence. The lawyer compiled everything neatly. When they submitted it to the judge's office, it raised more questions, not just about this case, but about how many others might have been handled the same way. Meanwhile, Daniel's mood darkened. He didn't like being questioned. He told himself it was just another civilian trying to twist things. But deep down he felt something unfamiliar, unease. He went over the paperwork again late one night, sitting in his dimly lit office. He knew exactly what he had done. He had changed the name on the affidavit because the original witness refused to cooperate, and he needed someone to fill the gap. He told himself it wasn't a big deal, just paperwork. Nobody would notice. But now someone had. For the first time, Daniel realized that one wrong move could expose everything. He thought about fixing it somehow, maybe pulling some strings with the clerk or calling in a favor with the prosecutor. But the system that had always worked in his favor suddenly felt fragile. Clara, on the other hand, grew stronger with each passing day. She started speaking to people in her community about what happened. Some were afraid to talk, but a few whispered that they'd had strange encounters with the same officer. A pattern was forming. What started as one woman's confusion was slowly becoming a quiet movement for truth. When Daniel saw her again in the hallway weeks later, she wasn't the same nervous woman he'd spoken to on the phone. She looked him straight in the eye. "You picked the wrong person," she said softly. He didn't respond, but the words stayed with him long after she walked away. At the station, rumors started to spread. A few officers had heard about the court hearing. Some defended Daniel, saying civilians didn't understand how complicated the job could be. Others stayed quiet, remembering how he had treated them in the past. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the air shift. The respect he once commanded without effort now seemed thinner, more fragile. He began spending more time alone, working late, trying to stay ahead of whatever was coming. But every time he looked at that file, he saw Clara's name and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. He didn't know that Clara's lawyer had already filed a formal complaint with the state attorney's office. They had started reviewing not only her case but several others connected to Daniel. What had begun as a single summons was now turning into an investigation. As autumn crept into the town, the leaves outside the courthouse began to fall. Daniel still walked the same halls with his badge shining under the lights, but it no longer felt like armor. It felt like a weight pressing against his chest. The same badge that once made him untouchable was now the very thing that could bring him down. And while Daniel tried to hold on to his power, Clara was just beginning to understand hers. She had no badge, no authority, no connections, just truth on her side. And sometimes that's enough to make even the strongest fall. The days that followed were tense for everyone, especially Daniel. The courthouse had ordered the documents in Clara's case to be reviewed, and that meant more eyes would be on his work. For years he'd managed to stay clear of trouble because no one dared to look too closely. Now he could feel that protection slipping away. He walked through the station as usual, but the air around him felt different. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. People who once greeted him with easy smiles now avoided eye contact. He told himself it was just nerves, that people were overreacting to a simple misunderstanding. But deep down, a quiet fear had started to grow, one he refused to admit even to himself. Clara, on the other hand, was doing everything she could to stay calm. Her lawyer had been gathering proof, making sure every record and timestamp lined up perfectly. They had camera footage from her shop showing she had been working the entire day of the supposed incident. Customers gave written statements confirming it too. Piece by piece, her defense was becoming stronger. Still, it wasn't easy. Clara barely slept. Every time her phone rang, her stomach tightened. She worried about her business, her reputation, and what people might think. Small-town gossip spread fast, and not everyone believed her side. Some customers stopped visiting her shop. A few neighbors avoided eye contact when she walked past. It hurt, but she told herself she couldn't give up now, not when she knew she was telling the truth. Her lawyer, Mr. Hayes, encouraged her. "We're close," he said one evening as they reviewed documents. "If we can prove this pattern, it's not just about your case anymore. It's about how he's been working for years." Clara nodded, but she didn't want to think too far ahead. For her, it was still personal. She just wanted her name cleared and her peace back. Meanwhile, inside the police department, the cracks were getting wider. Officer Lewis had quietly shared what he found with a trusted clerk in the court's records office. The part of the affidavit that showed Clara's name had been added later. That single piece of evidence had started to circulate among a few higher-ups. They were careful, whispering only in empty hallways or behind closed doors. No one wanted to be caught talking about Daniel, but they also knew something was wrong. Daniel noticed the shift. When he entered the break room one morning, two officers stopped their conversation mid-sentence. He poured himself coffee, pretending not to care, but his hands trembled slightly. He didn't like being the topic of quiet talk. He had built his career on control of people, of stories, of outcomes. And now that control was slipping. At home, the tension followed him. His wife barely spoke to him anymore. When she did, her voice carried exhaustion rather than anger. "You're not the man you used to be," she said one night as he sat in the living room staring at the news. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned the volume up. Silence was easier than facing the truth. The following week, Clara received a call from the state attorney's office. They wanted to speak with her in person. When she arrived, they greeted her kindly and asked for a full account of what had happened, from the day she received the summons to the court hearing. She told them everything, her voice steady but filled with emotion. They listened closely, taking notes. When she was done, one of the investigators leaned forward and said, "We've had a few similar complaints in the past, but none with as much evidence as yours. You did the right thing coming forward." Clara felt a wave of relief but also a deep sadness. She wasn't happy that others might have gone through the same thing. It made her realize this wasn't just about her anymore. Word of the investigation reached Daniel within days. The moment he heard, he slammed his office door shut and sat in silence. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him. He wanted to call someone, maybe a judge or an old friend in the prosecutor's office, but he stopped himself. He knew how it would look. Any attempt to interfere would make things worse. That night, he drove aimlessly through town. The same streets he once patrolled with pride now felt smaller, colder. He parked near the courthouse and stared at the building, its lights glowing against the dark sky. It used to feel like his territory, a place where he was in charge. Now, it looked like a place waiting to judge him. Inside, Clara's case file was being reviewed by internal affairs. They pulled old reports, compared dates, and looked for patterns. What they found was unsettling. Inconsistencies, missing witness statements, altered timelines. Daniel's name appeared in many of them. Some of those cases had been closed years ago, the accused long forgotten, but the pattern was there. The department's chief, a quiet man who rarely showed emotion, called Daniel into his office one morning. "Sit down," he said. The air was heavy between them. "There are questions about your reports. The review board will want to speak with you." Daniel kept his face neutral. "Questions? About what?" "About procedures. About signatures. About how some names ended up on official documents that shouldn't have." Daniel forced a small laugh. "You think I'd risk my career for something that small?" The chief didn't smile. Small things add up. That night, Daniel sat at his desk long after everyone had gone home. He opened the drawer and pulled out his badge. It had always been his symbol of strength, but now it felt like a reminder of everything he was about to lose. He thought about Clara, how calm she'd looked walking out of the courtroom, how sure of herself she had become. It made him angry, but beneath that anger was something else. Guilt. He didn't want to admit it, but somewhere inside he knew she didn't deserve what was happening. She had simply stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. He'd used her name to make a case stronger, never imagining it would come back to haunt him. Now, that single act had set everything in motion. Clara continued to focus on her shop, trying to live normally while the investigation continued. People started to notice her courage. A few even came by to show support. "You're doing the right thing," one customer told her. "It takes a lot to stand up to someone like him." Her lawyer kept her updated as new information surfaced. "They're finding more inconsistencies," he said. "It's not just your case anymore. They're rechecking at least 6 others." Clara felt a mix of relief and disbelief. "How did he get away with it for so long?" she asked quietly. Hayes sighed. "Because people trusted him. Because no one wanted to believe someone with a badge could lie." The investigation grew. Local news began asking questions. Reporters waited outside the courthouse trying to get comments. Daniel avoided them, keeping his head down and his answers short. But the story was spreading faster than he could control it. At the station, he was no longer the man everyone respected. Some still spoke to him out of habit, but others kept their distance. Even his old friends seemed unsure how to act around him. He could feel his world shrinking day by day. Then came the moment he dreaded, a formal notice ordering him to appear before the Internal Affairs Board. It wasn't an arrest, not yet, but it was serious. It meant they had enough questions to take action if his answers didn't satisfy them. That evening, he sat alone in his car outside the police station, the engine off, the keys resting in his lap. The badge on his chest felt heavier than ever. For years it had been his shield, his proof that he was above the mess of ordinary life. Now it felt like a target. Across town, Clara was closing her shop for the night. She stepped outside and looked at the darkening sky. For the first time in weeks, she felt a strange calm settle over her. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she had done everything she could. And somewhere in that same small town, Daniel sat staring into the darkness, realizing that the control he had clung to all his life was gone. The walls he built around himself were cracking, and soon everyone would see the truth he had spent years hiding. The storm that had been quietly building was no longer far away. It was here, and it was only a matter of time before it broke open completely. The news about the investigation spread faster than Daniel expected. Within days, almost everyone in town had heard that one of their most trusted officers was under review. It was all anyone could talk about, in diners, barbershops, and even church parking lots. Some people were shocked. Others said they weren't surprised at all. It was as if the whole town had been waiting for something like this to happen, but no one had dared to say it aloud until now. Daniel tried to ignore the whispers. He told himself that he could still fix things, that his years of service and connections would protect him. But deep down, he knew something had changed. The system that once shielded him was beginning to crumble. People who had always backed him were suddenly quiet. Calls went unanswered. Doors that used to open easily were now locked tight. Clara, meanwhile, was becoming stronger with every passing day. What started as a nightmare had turned into a mission. She had proof, witnesses, and now, support from people who had their own stories to tell. They came to her quietly at first. A man who said his business was unfairly targeted. A woman who claimed her report was altered after she filed it. Their voices were soft, nervous, but together they started forming a pattern. Her lawyer, Mr. Hayes, gathered all the testimonies carefully. "Each one of these cases points back to Daniel," he said one afternoon as they sat in his office surrounded by folders and documents. "He's been using his authority to control outcomes for years. Yours just happens to be the one that caught light." Clara felt a mix of emotions. She wasn't happy about anyone else's pain, but she was grateful she wasn't alone anymore. For months she had been treated like a liar, and now people were finally listening. She had no power, no badge, but she had truth on her side, and that was starting to matter. When a small local journalist reached out for an interview, Clara hesitated. She wasn't sure if going public was a good idea. Her lawyer warned her to be careful, but something inside her said it was time. "If I stay quiet," she said softly, "he'll keep doing this to others." The article came out the following week. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just honest. It told Clara's story in simple words, describing how one mistake in paperwork turned into a fight for justice. The journalist mentioned other people with similar experiences, all connected to the same officer. The piece ended with a single line that stayed in everyone's mind. "Power means nothing when it's built on fear." By the next morning, the article had spread across town. People shared it on social media, commented, debated, and argued. Some defended Daniel, saying he had done a lot of good for the town. Others said it was time someone held him accountable. Daniel read the article in his office. Each word felt like a blow. He had faced criminals, critics, and even lawsuits before, but nothing cut as deep as public doubt. For the first time in years, he felt exposed. The authority he had worn like armor was now being questioned by the very people who once looked up to him. His temper grew short. When younger officers asked questions, he snapped at them. When his supervisor requested updates, he replied in sharp, defensive tones. "It's all lies," he told anyone who would listen. "She's twisting the story to make herself look like a victim." But the evidence was too strong to ignore. The state investigators had uncovered more files showing signs of tampering. Some of the documents dated back nearly a decade. Each one made the case against him harder to defend. One afternoon, Daniel was called to another meeting with the Internal Affairs Board. This time it wasn't just questions, it was confrontation. They showed him the reports, the mismatched signatures, the altered statements. He tried to explain, but the words sounded weak even to him. Every sentence he spoke seemed to dig the hole deeper. When the meeting ended, one of the investigators looked at him and said quietly, "You've built your career on control, officer. But you can't control the truth." Daniel left the room without replying. The hallway outside felt longer than ever. He walked past familiar faces that now looked away. The whispers followed him like shadows. At home, things were no better. His wife had started packing a few of her things. "I can't keep doing this," she told him, her voice tired. "You think you're untouchable, but look where it's gotten you." He didn't answer. He simply stood by the window, staring out into the empty street. Meanwhile, Clara's life was slowly returning to normal, or as close to normal as it could get. Her flower shop was busy again. People stopped by to thank her for standing up. Some even left small notes of encouragement on her counter, but she never let herself forget how it all started. She still woke up some nights thinking about that first phone call, about the fear she'd felt hearing Daniel's voice on the other end of the line. The town, once quiet, now buzzed with the sound of truth being uncovered. The police department announced that it was reopening several of Daniel's old cases. Reporters camped outside the courthouse waiting for any updates. The story had grown bigger than anyone expected. Inside the department, Daniel tried to act as if nothing had changed, but everyone could see it. The confidence he once carried was gone. His shoulders sagged, his tone softer. Even the new recruits who had once looked up to him now avoided eye contact. He felt alone in the place he had ruled for so long. One evening, as he was clearing out his desk, Officer Lewis approached him. The young man's expression was hesitant, but his voice steady. "You taught me a lot," he said quietly. "But you also taught me what not to become." Daniel stared at him, unsure how to respond. "You think you're better than me?" he asked bitterly. Lewis shook his head. "No, I just think there's a right way to wear that badge." And then he walked away, leaving Daniel in silence. That night, Daniel drove to the outskirts of town and parked by the old bridge that overlooked the river. He sat there for a long time, the engine off, the night air cool against his face. He thought about the years he'd spent chasing respect, about the people he'd hurt without realizing it. For the first time, he began to see how far he'd fallen. He wanted to blame Clara, the system, anyone but himself. But deep down, he knew. He had crossed too many lines for too long, believing his badge would always protect him. He had mistaken fear for respect and authority for justice. Back in town, Clara received another call from her lawyer. "The investigators are recommending formal charges," he said. "They'll probably suspend him by the end of the week." Clara didn't cheer. She didn't feel victorious. She just felt a quiet kind of relief, like the weight she'd been carrying for months was finally beginning to lift. She thanked her lawyer and sat in silence for a while, watching the sunset outside her window. The next morning, the news became official. Daniel had been placed on leave while the investigation continued. The police chief held a brief press conference, saying the department would cooperate fully with all legal procedures. It was polite, formal, and distant, the kind of statement that told everyone Daniel was now on his own. He watched the announcement from his living room, the television light flickering across his tired face. For the first time, he had no control, no say, no power. The badge that once made him feel invincible was sitting on the table in front of him, catching the light but meaning nothing. Across town, Clara locked up her flower shop and took a deep breath. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she had done what she set out to do. She had spoken up. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone that truth, no matter how small, could still stand against power. The wind outside was cool and gentle that evening, and for the first time in a long while, both of them, the officer who thought he was untouchable and the woman he had wronged, felt the same thing. The world had finally shifted, and it would never go back to the way it was. The days after Daniel's suspension felt unreal to almost everyone in town. Some people said it was about time, while others thought it was all blown out of proportion. But one thing was clear. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now just another name in the headlines. Daniel stayed home most of the time. His phone barely rang anymore. The calls that did come were either reporters or old colleagues pretending to check in, while secretly fishing for updates. He ignored most of them. The badge that once opened doors now closed them. He sat for hours at his kitchen table, staring at the paperwork piled up in front of him. There were letters from the department, notes from his lawyer and newspaper clippings he couldn't bring himself to throw away. Every headline carried his name, each one a reminder of how far he'd fallen. Outside, life went on. Patrol cars still passed his house, but none stopped. His neighbors avoided eye contact. Even the kids who used to wave when he drove by now crossed to the other side of the street. He told himself it didn't matter, that people were just fickle, but inside it stung. His wife had moved in with her sister for a while. The silence in the house was deafening. The sound of her laughter, once familiar, was gone. All that remained was the ticking of the clock and the distant hum of cars. Daniel tried to distract himself by reading old case files, as if looking through them could somehow restore his sense of control. But the more he read, the more he saw what others must have seen too. Small things he had ignored or twisted to fit what he wanted. Back then, he told himself he was doing the right thing, that bending the rules helped get justice faster. Now it all looked different. Across town, Clara's life was taking a different turn. She wasn't living in fear anymore. The investigation had brought her strength she never knew she had. She was back at her shop, greeting customers, arranging flowers, and trying to rebuild her normal routine. But she had changed too. People came to her now, not just for flowers, but for advice. Some asked how she had found the courage to stand up. Others simply wanted to share their own stories. Clara listened to them all, knowing how much it meant to be heard. Her lawyer, Mr. Hayes, kept her updated on the investigation. It was moving slowly, but progress was being made. "They've found more irregularities," he said one afternoon, flipping through a folder. "It's not just your case anymore. There's a whole string of them." Clara listened quietly. She didn't feel joy or revenge, just a quiet understanding that this was bigger than her now. "Do you think he knows how much damage he's done?" she asked softly. Mr. Hayes sighed. "Maybe not yet, but sooner or later everyone has to face what they've done." A few weeks later, the hearing was announced. It wasn't a criminal trial yet, just a formal review to decide if Daniel's actions had broken department policy. But the outcome would shape everything that came after. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, waiting for the man who once commanded so much respect to walk through those doors like anyone else. The morning of the hearing, Daniel stood in front of the mirror trying to tie his tie. His hands trembled slightly. He hadn't worn a suit in weeks. His reflection looked older, heavier somehow. There were dark circles under his eyes and a deep weariness in his face. He took a deep breath, picked up his briefcase, and stepped outside. The air was cold and the sky was pale gray, the kind of morning that felt like it was holding its breath. At the courthouse, cameras flashed the moment he arrived. Questions were shouted, but he kept his head down and walked inside. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the hallway. For a man who used to walk these halls with pride, it felt strange to be there as the one being judged. Inside the hearing room, the seats were filled. Clara was there too, sitting quietly near the back. She hadn't planned on attending at first, but something told her she needed to see it through. Not out of spite, but closure. When Daniel looked up and saw her, their eyes met for just a moment. Neither of them spoke, but in that brief exchange, there was a weight of everything that had happened. The choices, the lies, the pain. The board members began the proceedings, reading through the reports and presenting evidence. Each page told a story: altered statements, delayed reports, ignored complaints. With every example, Daniel felt smaller in his seat. When it was his turn to speak, he tried to defend himself. "I did what I thought was right," he said, his voice steady but tired. "You spend years in this job, you see things most people can't imagine. Sometimes you have to make tough calls." One of the board members leaned forward. "But those tough calls, as you call them, hurt innocent people. Do you understand that, officer?" Daniel hesitated. The word officer felt like a knife. For the first time, he didn't know how to answer. He looked around the room and saw faces he recognized. Fellow officers, court staff, even a few people he had once helped. None of them smiled. The hearing lasted hours. When it ended, the board announced that they would need time to review everything before making a decision. Daniel walked out into the hallway, exhausted. Clara stayed seated for a few moments longer. Watching him leave didn't bring her joy, but it did bring something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Outside, Daniel stood on the courthouse steps, staring at the crowd. The cameras were still there, but now he didn't care. He wasn't the man they had come to see. He was just someone trying to understand where it all went wrong. In the days that followed, the department began cleaning up his old cases. A few were reopened. Others were dismissed entirely. The new police chief made a public statement promising to rebuild trust. Clara watched the press conference from her shop. She thought about how one decision, standing up, speaking out, had changed so much. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. That evening, she went for a walk through town. The streets felt different now, lighter somehow. People greeted her with kindness. Some smiled, some nodded, but all carried a quiet respect. As for Daniel, he spent his evenings sitting on his porch, staring out into the distance. He didn't know what the future would bring, whether he'd face charges or if there was still a way to make things right. But for the first time in his life, he was forced to sit with his own silence and face what he had become. He thought about the badge that once made him feel powerful, and he realized something he had never seen before. It had never made him untouchable. It had only made him blind, and as the sun went down over the quiet town, he understood that the truth, once revealed, could not be buried again. Not by authority, not by fear, and not by the illusion of power. The decision came on a cloudy morning that felt heavier than usual. The courthouse was quiet, but everyone inside could sense that something important was about to happen. For weeks, people had been waiting to hear what would come of Daniel's case, whether the man once seen as a hero would finally face justice. Daniel arrived early, wearing the same dark suit from the last hearing. It no longer fit him the same way. He had lost weight, and his shoulders drooped under the weight of everything that had happened. His lawyer said little as they walked through the long hallway. Every echo of their footsteps felt like a reminder of how far he had fallen. When they entered the hearing room, the atmosphere was tense but calm. Reporters were waiting outside, but only a few were allowed in. The board members sat at the front, their papers stacked neatly in front of them. Clara sat quietly in the second row, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't there out of anger anymore. She was there because she needed closure. As the session began, the head of the board spoke firmly but without hostility. After reviewing all the evidence, the testimonies and the reports, she said, "We have reached our decision." Daniel sat perfectly still, his jaw tight. The board finds that Officer Daniel Hale acted in violation of department policy, repeatedly misused his authority, and filed falsified reports in multiple cases. Effective immediately, his employment with the department is terminated. Furthermore, we recommend the case be referred to the district attorney for review of possible criminal charges. The room went silent. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the soft clicking of cameras began from the back. Daniel stared straight ahead, expressionless. The words echoed in his mind: terminated, misuse, falsified. Each one cut deeper than the last. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. She didn't smile. It wasn't a moment for celebration, only relief. The truth had finally been spoken aloud, and there was no taking it back. When the session ended, people began to file out quietly. Daniel remained seated for a long time, his hands clasped tightly together. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but he didn't respond. Eventually, he stood and walked toward the exit, passing by Clara without a word. She didn't look away. Their eyes met briefly, and though there was no hatred between them, there was something even stronger: recognition. Outside, reporters shouted questions, but Daniel didn't answer. He pushed through the crowd, walked to his car, and drove away. It was over, at least for now. Over the next few weeks, the story dominated the news. Other officers came forward, revealing how Daniel had pressured them to bend rules or ignore complaints. The department launched an internal reform program, promising transparency and oversight. The new chief publicly thanked Clara for her courage, saying her actions had forced the department to confront its failures. Clara didn't seek the spotlight. She turned down interviews and refused to talk about the personal details. Instead, she focused on rebuilding her life. Her shop became a kind of quiet gathering place, a small symbol of resilience in a town that had lost some of its faith in authority. People would stop by just to talk. Some wanted to thank her. Others shared their own experiences, things they had been too afraid to mention before. Clara listened, always with patience. She never wanted to be seen as a hero. She just wanted to remind people that doing the right thing still mattered, even when it was hard. One afternoon, she received a letter in the mail. It was from Daniel. The handwriting was shaky, but it was his. She hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside was a short note. "Clara, I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say that I understand now. The badge made me forget who I was. You reminded me of what I lost. I'm sorry for everything. Daniel." Clara read it twice, then folded the paper neatly and placed it in a drawer. She didn't know if she could forgive him, but she could see the humanity behind the words. Maybe that was enough. Months passed. The investigation into Daniel's actions turned into a broader case. He eventually stood before a judge, facing charges of misconduct and perjury. The trial was shorter than anyone expected. Daniel pleaded guilty to reduced charges, avoiding jail time but losing all rights to serve in law enforcement again. When the sentence was read, he didn't argue. He simply nodded. He had already lost everything that once defined him. Now, all that was left was the long road of figuring out who he was without the badge. After the trial, Daniel moved away from town. No one knew exactly where. Some said he took a job in another state, working quietly, trying to start over. Others believed he lived alone somewhere on the edge of the county, away from the noise and the gossip. But every now and then, people said they saw him sitting by the old courthouse steps, just watching, as if trying to remember what went wrong and how it all began. For Clara, life moved forward in quiet, steady ways. Her shop flourished again. She started a small program that offered legal aid to local residents who couldn't afford it. It wasn't big or fancy, but it made a difference. One day she stood outside the courthouse where it had all begun. The morning sun painted the town in gold, and for the first time she felt completely free. Not because justice had been served perfectly, but because she had found her own peace. A reporter approached her, asking if she had any final thoughts now that everything was over. Clara smiled softly and said, "No one is above the truth, not even those who wear the badge." Her words spread quickly, quoted in newspapers and online stories. But to Clara, they weren't meant to sound powerful. They were just honest. As time went on, people began to remember the case not as a scandal, but as a turning point. The police department rebuilt its reputation slowly under new leadership. Training programs focused on ethics and community trust became mandatory. The town learned to look at justice not as a system run by titles, but as a shared responsibility. And somewhere far away, Daniel carried that lesson too. He spent his days quietly, avoiding attention. Sometimes he volunteered at a local shelter, helping others who had fallen on hard times. He never talked about his past, but the humility in his manner spoke volumes. At night, he would sit on his porch and think about the life he had once lived. The uniform, the authority, the fear he used to inspire. All of it seemed distant now, like a story that belonged to someone else. He realized that losing the badge had been his greatest punishment, but also his only chance at redemption. The story of Clara and Daniel became part of the town's history, a reminder of how power can blind, but truth always finds a way to surface. And though years passed, people still spoke about the woman who stood up against what was wrong, and the man who finally faced what he had done. Because in the end, justice wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about accountability, growth, and the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As the last light of the evening touched the courthouse windows, the town stood quieter than ever before. For the first time in a long while, it felt balanced, not perfect, but honest. And that honesty, fragile as it was, became the one thing that no badge, no authority, and no power could ever take away.